Well, good morning, Village Bible Church. How are you doing today? My name is Jeremy. I'm the campus pastor at Indian Creek campus. It's a privilege to be here with you today in Sugar Grove to open God's Word together. I want to welcome all of you. Glad to have each of you here. If today's your first time visiting with us, welcome. Thanks for choosing to worship with us today. If you're joining us online, glad to have you tagging along in part of our worship service today. I'd like to invite all of you to open your Bibles with me, if you haven't already, to John chapter 13, where we're going to devote our attention this morning. We are continuing in a series that we've been in for quite some time, so if you've been with us, we are in this for the long haul. We started this back in August, taking a look at Jesus' life and ministry, and we've been doing so through the lens of one of his closest disciples and arguably one of his dearest friends as well, John. We have recently closed the door, if you will, on his public ministry and now have a behind-the-scenes view into his personal and private ministry as he spends time with his disciples in the final hours before the cross. Last week, Joe Denner spent some time talking with us about the really beautiful lessons that we had in the washing of the disciples' feet, lessons of Jesus' enduring love for his disciples, his humble service, his patient teaching. And the passage that we're going to be talking about this morning really jumps in right in the middle of that whole scene. As Jesus wraps that up and has taken his seat again at the table, he begins talking with his disciples, and that's where we are jumping in today. What we are going to find in our text before us is that touching moment, if you will, that intimate moment between Jesus and the guys is going to kind of come to a screeching halt. We're going to feel the air being sucked out of the room, if you will, with a change of tide. Now, I remember as a freshman in high school, there was one day that we got a phone call at the house, and it was from the mom of my best friend, Corey. Corey and I had been best friends all through elementary school and middle school. And he had just recently gone to a new school, so we didn't see each other nearly as often as we had before. And so typically when his mom would call the house, she was trying to set something up for us to get to hang out for the weekend. So I was getting a little excited. I was like, my weekend's about to get a lot better. So my mom talks to her for a little bit, and she comes back in the room, and I was all eager and excited and asked, so should I be getting my stuff ready, right? Am I going to go to Corey's house for a couple days or for the night? And my mom had kind of a check in her spirit, and I kind of picked up on her nonverbals that I don't think I was going to be going to Corey's house. And she paused for a minute, and as I look back, probably trying to figure out how in the world do I tell my freshman this, but she said that Corey's mom had called not to invite me over or to see if Corey could come over, but she called to let us know that Corey had passed away the night before. And I remember as a freshman, I had no framework at that point to dealing with that kind of news. I remember thinking it couldn't be true. She was kidding. She was lying to me. I remember wrestling with God. God, why? How? What are you doing? All those questions that we have. And I'm sure you've had similar circumstances. Times in your life where you got news that you didn't expect, news that rocked your world, left you feeling like your life was falling apart around you. How do I make sense of everything in the midst of this? The feelings that you felt in those moments, the feelings that I felt hearing that my best friend died, I'm sure are similar to the feelings that the disciples must have been feeling at this time sitting with Jesus. Here they are, they have come to Jerusalem for Passover, and as they sit with Jesus behind closed doors, John tells us at the end of verse 30, 4 words, and it was night. Those 4 words give us a glimpse into the seriousness and the weightiness of the moment that they were living in right then and right there, and it was night. Those 4 words, no doubt, communicated very simply that it was nighttime. But as we understand from reading through John's gospel, those 4 words are packed full of meaning. Before he would write those down 10 times in his gospel, the motif of light and darkness or day and night has been used over and over and over again, including 3 times by Jesus himself to talk about how the light is there only for a little while, that the night is coming. John chapter 9, verse 4, Jesus tells his disciples, we must work the works of him who sent me while it's day. Night is coming when no one can work. Chapter 11, are there not 12 hours in a day? If anyone walks in the day, he doesn't stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light's not in him. Chapter 12, the light is among you for a little while longer. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. Throughout John's gospel, it's been coming. It's coming. It's coming. The night is coming. And now as John reflects back on these moments with Jesus, these moments that are unfolding right here in Jerusalem at the Feast of Passover, he says, and it was night. And it was night. D.A. Carson calls it the hour of the power of darkness, and it has fallen quite unexpectedly, if you will, in the disciples' shoes. Here they are coming for a festival, a time of celebration, a time of remembrance of God's faithfulness to His people throughout all their generations, a time to celebrate their mighty and good God, a time to celebrate their merciful God. And so as they sit here behind closed doors, sharing this special meal together with Jesus, Jesus drops the bomb on them. And not just one, but three. Three that will leave them reeling, if you will, in the moment, feeling like their lives are falling apart around them, upsetting the normalcy of what they had come to know and believe. And so we see in our passage today, right at the get-go, that night falls, if you will, with the alarming news of disloyalty. Verse 21, Jesus says, with a troubled spirit, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." One of you will betray me. Verse 22 tells us it left the disciples feeling uncertain. You can imagine the confusion. They're looking at each other, not uncertain of whom Jesus spoke. It's not like they were sitting there and they had some sort of a framework or a guess as to who Jesus could be talking about. They had nothing. Here they were, and they had no clue who Jesus was talking about. They weren't nudging each other saying, "I knew it. It's Matthew. You know, Matthew has been, he had betrayed his people before. Now he's going to betray Jesus." They're not nudging each other and saying, "Well, Peter's unchecked passion is finally going to get the best of him." They're not sitting there saying, "It's got to be James, because how could you sit back and watch your brother have all of this and just sit back and follow along? He's got to go for his own." They had no frame of reference. None of them knew who Jesus was talking about. And so Peter, looking across the table to John, who's sitting there right next to Jesus, you can imagine the look that he gives him, like the ask him who it is. Just quietly, like, he'll tell you. Come on, who's the guy? So John leans back and asks Jesus, "Who is it? Who is it?" And Jesus tells him, "It's he whom I will give this morsel of bread when I've dipped it." And so when he had dipped the morsel, verse 26 here, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And so in that moment, John and Judas would have been the two guys having any idea of what's going on. None of the other guys knew what was happening. As a matter of fact, we're told that after Judas took the morsel, Jesus tells him, "Buddy, let's get on with it. Let's not twiddle our thumbs anymore. Let's get the job done. What you're going to do it quickly." And Judas gets up and leaves. And we're told that the disciples still have no idea of what's going on. They think, well, perhaps Judas was the one, he was going to get stuff for the feast. He was the one with the money back. Maybe he was going to give some alms to the poor, which would have been a customary thing to do at Passover. But the reality is, John tells us, is much darker than that. John tells us in verse 27 that after he had taken the morsel from Jesus, that Satan entered into him. It's no wonder that John looks back on this and says, "And it was night." Because in that moment, there was no day, there was no light in Judas's heart. He had been overcome by darkness. And I know the reality is, as we look at a passage or a verse like that and see that Satan entered into him, and for some it may cause an alarm. Is Satan going to come and enter into me and turn me into a puppet for his evil and wicked plans and purposes? I don't want that to happen. But before we go and jump to conclusions and build a theology around one verse in the Scriptures, let's pause for a second. Let's slow down. John's not giving us a prescription here of this is how things always happen. He's describing what happened then and there. it is super important for us to stop and remember that Satan is not omnipresent like God is. Right? We oftentimes think of Satan being all the place, all the time. Satan is in one place at any given moment. Only God is everywhere all the time. And so it tells us that in this moment, that Satan was right there, that of all the places Satan could have been, he was in that spot. Something significant was going on. This isn't prescribing the norm. This is telling us about a unique and significant moment in the course of human history. If you remember, Jesus has indicated multiple times through his gospel that Judas was even chosen for this very purpose. That's a hard thing to wrestle with. If you remember back to John chapter 6, Jesus has amassed a great number of crowds, lots of people coming to listen to Jesus and follow him, and he gives the crowd reduction sermon. You remember that one where he says, if you want to be part of this, you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And the crowds are like, that's it, I'm done. That's too much for me. This man's nuts. And so Jesus turns to his disciples as everybody else is leaving. What about you guys? And Peter says, who else are we supposed to go to? You have the words of eternal life. And Jesus tells them, have I not chosen you, the 12? Not have I chosen you, the 11, and then number 12 kind of snuck in through the back door. Have I not chosen you, the 12, and yet one of you is the devil? Even then, Jesus knew. Chapter 13, Jesus says, I know whom I have chosen. I know whom I have chosen. So here we have a unique circumstance, a unique time in which Judas was chosen for this purpose. And yet Judas had the opportunities. Can you imagine, if you will, as Jesus says to the guys, one of you will betray me. You almost wonder if there wasn't eye contact made between Jesus and Judas in that moment. It's all speculation, I'll admit that. But he had the opportunity to say, he's on to me, I abort a mission. I'm done, I can't do it. But in this moment, it was the desire of Judas' heart to follow through. James chapter 1 tells us, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. We can be tempted to look at Judas and be like, well, perhaps he's just a puppet here and he had no say in the matter, but the reality is, in this moment, that's what he wanted. Why? It's hard to wrap your head around that one. But something significant was taking place. And so after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out. And the disciples, the rest of the guys, are left there in the room, still in confusion, still in uncertainty, not understanding what's going on. They didn't know that Judas was going to betray Jesus right then and right there. And I think that confusion, uncertainty is by divine design. Because could you imagine, if you will, that the guys knew exactly what Judas was going to do? Do you think they would have let him leave the room? Do you think fiery Peter would have hesitated for a second before putting Judas on the floor and saying, not a chance, buddy. You're not going to do what you're planning on doing. See, Jesus gave the disciples everything that they needed to know to believe. He didn't give them everything. There are some things that were above their pay grade, and that's okay. There are things that are above our pay grade. That's okay. He has given everything that is needed for belief. If you go back to verse 19 of chapter 13, Jesus has just told them that the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. He gives them what they need so that they would believe that he is the Christ, that he is the Son of God. It's okay to leave them in a bit of confusion here so they don't take the place of God and try to take things into their own hands. Stick to your pay grade. But what's happening is a fulfillment of Psalm 41:9. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. This picture of when David is lamenting his closest of friends having turned against him. The one who ate my bread is not just a casual friend, but this picture of someone who is so close and intimate with me, who I love dearly, who has now lifted his heel, this picture of such a stark contrast, that how could one so close, so loved, do something so heinous and so evil? And Jesus says, so it will be fulfilled in me. And so Jesus gives Judas that morsel of bread, and I want us to understand the significance here, because I know for me, most of my life, I think of it as Jesus just ripping off a piece of bread, maybe a piece of that white bread you'll make your sandwich with for lunch, and just handing it to Judas and calling it good. There was great significance here. To share a morsel of bread like this would have been a sign of great love and honor, because it wasn't just taking the scrap, it was taking like the best bite. So you're picturing taking this bread and scooping it and getting all the herbs, all the best flavors into one beautiful bite, and then giving it to somebody else. For those of you who aren't bread people, it'd be like giving the center of the cinnamon roll to someone else, because I know that hits home. The best bite, the best thing. You don't give the center of the cinnamon roll to just anybody. That person means something to you. It's an act of love to do that, and honor. It's such a picture of Jesus' love on display here, even as he's identifying his betrayer. How huge. But Jesus tells them all this so that they would believe, because can you imagine in a few short hours, as the disciples come to realize what Judas has done, they start asking questions. Can you imagine the question that we have spent so much time with him? How did I not see it coming? Could I have stopped it? Could I have done anything? Can you imagine the question? How did Jesus not see this coming? Didn't Jesus say he knows his sheep? And so he tells them. So in those moments, when the questions start flooding, and the confusion, and the how could it be, that they would stop and remember that Jesus said this. That Jesus wasn't shocked by it. He wasn't taken off guard, but that he was in control and he knew all along, so that they would believe that he is the Christ. That it wouldn't deter them from believing in him any longer. So we see night falls with the alarming news of betrayal, of disloyalty. Secondly, night falls with the alarming news of departure. Jesus goes on. Now he says to the guys after Judas leaves, you almost wonder if there's a breath of fresh air, like, okay, he's out of here. Let me talk to these guys now. When he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and glorify him at once. And just for fun, I'd like to encourage you over lunch today to say that 10 times fast, and see who can do it the best. Lots of glory here. Lots of stuff going on, and you can almost imagine the questioning, okay, one of us is going to betray you. And now you're talking about all this glory that's taking place, and this wondering of what's happening. And then Jesus goes on and drops the second bomb on them. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. Can you feel the second blow hit their hearts? What else you got? One of us is going to do some terrible thing. We don't know who it is. Now you're leaving us. And here they got to be sitting there thinking, this is not how the Passover meal is supposed to go. Bad news upon bad news. And before they could ask Jesus any questions, he goes on and he tells them in verse 34, a new commandment I give to you. And I imagine them sitting there in the quietness. There's no chatter going on now. You got to imagine the silence that they're sitting in, trying to make sense of what Jesus is saying. Now their teacher is leaving them. The one they love, the one they follow, he's going to leave them. And he says he has a new commandment for them. And I imagine my question would be, well, what does the new commandment have to do with this? How is that supposed to help me now? That doesn't help make me feel any better about what's going on. But this commandment is huge. He says, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. That's not so new. Leviticus 19, God gives in the law to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus quotes that, doesn't he, in Mark chapter 12, when he's challenged by the scribe, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says what? To love the Lord your God Well, your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Not a new commandment. But yet Jesus says he's giving them something new. Look at how he explains it. He goes on and says, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. So he heightens the stakes, if you will, because not only are we supposed to love like we love ourselves now we're supposed to love as Jesus loved us. That's totally different. That's the newness. He's changed the model in which the love is supposed to happen. It's not just our own selfish love. It's now the selfless, humble, patient love that we have seen modeled in the person of Christ throughout his entire ministry. Love as I have loved you. And that takes on a whole new game. That transforms the conversation. It's not about us anymore. As he has emptied himself and humbled himself to serve us, so we should for each other. And Jesus says this, by this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. By this. He does not say that it is by your intellect. He does not say that it's by your apologetic arguments, your persistent Facebook posts. He doesn't say any of those things. He says the world will know that you are my disciples by your love for one another. One defining feature of a disciple of Jesus Christ that sets him apart from anyone. Love as Jesus loves. That's massive. That's massive. Ray Ortlund says in his book titled The Gospel, How the Church Portrays the Beauty of Christ. He says that the promise of Christ is that our love will show a skeptical world the difference that he really makes. Love is Christ's authorized way for us to be convincing. People today don't care about doctrine, but they do care about love. The world is not impressed by anything about us but the love of Christ, nor should they be. If we fail to love one another in ways so striking that we actually start looking like Jesus, then the world has the right to judge that we know nothing of him. They might be wrong. We might indeed be Christians, but the world is right to dismiss unloving Christians as unchristian. Jesus himself gave them that right. And man, does he nail it on the head. They have the right to dismiss unloving Christians as unchristian because Jesus gave them that right. If we fail to love in ways that are so striking, we begin to look like Jesus. Holy cow. Love as I have loved you, a new commandment. And so Jesus is in effect saying, yes, guys, I'm leaving you. You cannot follow me right now. You cannot do what I'm about to do. You cannot come with me. But in my leaving, the world will see me in great ways. Because no longer is it just looking at me, it is now looking at me in all of you. So that even today, as we love one another as Christ has loved us, the world gets a glimpse of the love of Christ. That's the model that he has given. And that's huge. And so we look at what's coming here as we go into verse 36, and Simon responds to Jesus. You almost imagine a moment of silence there where they're contemplating these things. He says, well, Lord, where are you going? Where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. And so Peter says, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I'd lay my life down for you. And before we criticize Peter, I don't think it's so much him trying to challenge Jesus, but this confused love and devotion. Like, it made sense, right, when Jesus said to the Jews, you can't go where I'm going. It made sense for them because the Jews didn't love Jesus. The Jews didn't believe in Jesus. The Jews didn't follow Jesus. But Peter's like, what gives? I do. I love you. I would die for you. No doubt thinking of just a few moments ago as he's like, don't wash my feet. Who are you to wash my feet? And Jesus said, if I don't wash you, you have no share with me. Well, then not my feet, but my hands and my head also. He's like, I'm all in for you, Jesus. How could you say that I can't follow with you? And Jesus drops the last bit of bad news that has shocked them. He challenges them. Will you? Will you lay your life down for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow until you have denied me 3 times. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Jesus says, The bad news number 3 here is denial. So you imagine putting yourself there in the situation. Peter, full of passion and love for Christ, no doubt the guys know that, and here they're sitting there and witnessing this as Jesus says, Peter, your passion is going to come up altogether short. Rather than going to the death for me, you're actually going to become a coward. You will be a coward and deny me 3 times but in just a few hours. So you imagine Peter sitting there a little bit shocked at the moment. What? Maybe a little embarrassed. But then the disciples looking at what's going on, they're saying, man, if one of our strongest, if one of the closest is going to fall. To them, their world was falling apart. Not Jesus' world. Jesus knew full well all that was happening. He had resolve. He knew it was to come. But for them, it was all unraveling before their eyes. You could almost imagine in that moment the defeat that the guys must have been feeling as they sat around the table. The silence in the room. And it was night. The darkness, the weight. There's disloyalty in our ranks. Who's going to be the one to betray? Jesus is going to leave us. They are left to wrestle with his departure. Peter, one of the strongest and closest, is going to deny him. Everything seems to be falling apart. But the disciples didn't have the full picture. They were living in that moment, then and there. And by the grace of God, I believe that Jesus is giving them a glimpse into what's to come so that when it happens, they're not caught floundering, but that they would believe and also have resolve. But in this moment, darkness is surrounding them. Chapter 14 hasn't come for them yet. Jesus reads the room and says, let not your hearts be troubled, but we'll address that next week. Chapter 20, where Christ rises from the dead, hasn't happened yet. They're living in that moment. They've just received that news. And their worlds are falling apart. But if there's one thing we can cling to today, it's this, that Jesus knew. Jesus knew. That in time, the disciples would come to learn that very truth. In time, they'd come to learn that Jesus knew. He knew that Judas was going to do this. He knew that Peter, he knew that the cross, he knew all of these things. And in that moment, that truth would be enough, Jesus says, to gird their faith, to strengthen their belief, that they would believe that he is the Son. I've told you this before it takes place, so that when it happens, you'd believe. Jesus knew. He wasn't surprised by Judas. Jesus wasn't shocked by Peter. He wasn't ambushed in the garden, and he wasn't stopped at the cross. In time, they'd come to learn and believe that Jesus knew. And that would change things altogether. John tells us at the beginning of his gospel in chapter 1, verse 5, he says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In the darkest hours, the light still shines. In the darkest hours, Jesus can say, now is the Son of Man glorified. The darkness does not overcome the light, but in this moment, they are living in the night. In this moment, they are feeling the weight of all that was about to unfold, feeling the confusion, feeling the uncertainty, feeling all of that. And it was night. The darkness does not overcome